Oyez, Quickie! Everyone knows that a jury has to come to a unanimous verdict on guilt or innocence. But it's actually a bit more than just what they show in the movies. They have to be unanimous on all the underlying elements as well. In Richardson v. United States, the Supreme Court confirmed that the jury must be unanimous as to the entire series of underlying offenses in a continuing criminal enterprise prosecution. The jury must unanimously agree not only that the defendant committed some continuing series of violations, but also about which specific violations make up that continuing series. The federal government charged Eddie Richardson with organizing a criminal gang that distributed crack, heroin, and cocaine. The jury convicted him, but only after the judge informed them that they don't need to agree on what the actual offenses were. There needed to be 3 or more offenses under the law, but the judge said the jury didn't have to be unanimous on what those actually were. Each juror could pick a different 3 and that'd be okay. The Supreme Court said, no way. Justice Stephen Breyer delivered the opinion. Federal crimes are made up of factual elements, which are ordinarily listed in the statute that defines the crime. A hypothetical robbery statute, for example, that makes it a crime to take from a person through force or the threat of force property belonging to a bank, would have defined the crime of robbery in terms of the 5 elements just mentioned. A jury in a federal criminal case cannot convict unless it unanimously finds that the government has proved each element. Where, for example, an element of robbery is force or the threat of force, some jurors might conclude that the defendant used a knife to create the threat. Others might conclude that he used a gun. But that disagreement, a disagreement about means, would not matter as long as all 12 jurors unanimously concluded that the government had proved the necessary related element, namely, that the defendant had threatened force. So the weapon would only become important if there were an additional charge, something like use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, but then they wouldn't necessarily need to agree on which firearm, a Glock or a Ruger. So it all depends on what are the actual elements of the crime or crimes alleged. The jury has to unanimously agree on each of those. Quote, where a substantive statute is at issue, for example, a statute forbidding a felon's possession of a firearm, the relevant precondition, namely that the gun possessor be a felon, means at a minimum that an earlier fact finder, e.g. a unanimous federal jury in the case of federal crime, found that the defendant in fact committed that earlier individual crime. The government's interpretation is inconsistent with this practice, for it, in effect, imposes punishment on a defendant for the underlying crimes without any fact finder having found that the defendant committed those crimes. Jury verdicts must be unanimous for all of the elements of the crime. There shouldn't be any close enough.